The moving truck rolled slowly through the iron gates just as the last light of evening faded behind the Manhattan skyline. Rain glazed the long stone driveway, turning every lantern into a trembling ribbon of gold across the wet pavement. Naomi Carter stood beneath the grand entrance of the Ashford mansion in a black cashmere coat, one hand resting quietly against the marble column as four movers carefully wheeled her mother's century-old grand piano toward the waiting truck. The polished ebony surface reflected flashes of lightning, while each turn of its brass wheels sounded louder than the distant thunder. It felt less like furniture leaving a house and more like history being escorted into exile. William Ashford watched from the top of the marble staircase in a perfectly tailored black suit, a crystal tumbler resting casually in one hand. Beside him stood Charlotte Hayes in an elegant white dress, her fingers lightly touching his arm with the practiced confidence of someone already imagining herself mistress of the entire estate. Eleanor Ashford adjusted the strand of pearls around her neck and studied the empty music room with visible satisfaction. "Finally," she said, her voice smooth as polished silver. "That old thing was taking up valuable space." William smiled without looking at Naomi. "It's only a piano," he said. "An antique dealer offered a generous price. We have no reason to keep collecting dust." Naomi never answered. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the instrument as the movers eased it through the massive front doors. Every scratch in the lacquer, every faded ivory key, every carved edge had once carried her mother's hands. Her mother had taught children who could never afford lessons, played charity concerts that quietly funded scholarships, and told Naomi that music survived because memory refused to disappear. William had never understood that. To him, value could always be measured by the latest appraisal. Charlotte glanced toward Naomi with a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. "We'll redesign this room," she said softly. "Something brighter." Eleanor nodded in approval. A modern house shouldn't feel like a museum. Rain intensified outside. One mover paused beneath the portico while securing heavy blankets around the piano before sliding it into the truck. Naomi noticed the brass maker's plaque catching a brief flash of lightning before the doors closed. William reached into his pocket, signed the final sales receipt resting on the antique dealer's clipboard, and handed it back with effortless confidence. The ownership had changed. The transaction was complete. At least that was what everyone believed. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment. Her wedding ring reflected against the rainwater gathering at her feet before she quietly slipped her hand into the pocket of her coat. She neither pleaded nor protested. She offered no reminder that her late mother's belongings had never truly belonged to William. She simply watched the truck pull away beyond the iron gates until its taillights disappeared into the darkness. Behind her, laughter drifted from the mansion as Charlotte began discussing colors for the renovated music room. William never noticed that Naomi did not follow the truck. She remained perfectly still beneath the falling rain, her silence deeper than grief itself. Naomi remained beneath the stone portico until the sound of the truck dissolved into the rain. Only then did she turn and walk back through the towering front doors of the Ashford mansion. The warmth inside felt artificial, wrapped in crystal chandeliers, polished marble, and the scent of fresh white orchids arranged precisely where every guest would notice them. Laughter drifted from the adjoining sitting room as Charlotte discussed replacing the music room with a private wine lounge, while Eleanor praised the decision as if removing the piano had somehow modernized the family itself. William accepted another glass of whiskey from a house attendant without once looking toward the empty doorway Naomi had entered through. To him, the evening had already concluded. The contract had been signed, the payment transferred, and another inconvenient reminder of Naomi's past had quietly disappeared. Naomi crossed the silent corridor alone. The music room stood open. For years, sunlight had poured across polished ebony every morning, filling the room with reflections that softened even the cold architecture of the mansion. Now only a pale rectangle remained in the hardwood floor where the grand piano had rested for decades. Fine dust outlined its former shape with unsettling precision, like the outline left behind after something precious had been removed from a museum. She stood motionless for several seconds before kneeling beside the empty space. Her fingertips brushed the floorboards where one brass well had worn a shallow mark into the wood. Her mother used to joke that beautiful things always left gentle scars behind. Naomi closed her eyes, but refused herself the comfort of tears. Grief would not change ownership. Emotion would not rewrite signatures. Silence, however, still belonged entirely to her. Slowly she rose and walked toward the antique walnut cabinet built into the far wall. Hidden behind rows of old music scores rested a narrow drawer that almost no one noticed because the carved molding disguised its outline perfectly. She pulled it open with calm familiarity. Inside lay nothing except faded velvet and the faint imprint of an object that had once rested there. The compartment was empty. Anyone else might have believed something valuable had been stolen long ago. Naomi merely studied the hollow space for a long moment before closing the drawer again without surprise. Her expression did not change. Outside, thunder rolled across the city while rain streaked down the enormous glass windows overlooking Manhattan. She caught her own reflection beside the empty room. A black woman in a dark coat standing where generations of music had once lived. Behind that reflection shimmered the distant lights of the skyline, brilliant and indifferent. Somewhere downstairs, Charlotte laughed again, followed by William's quiet voice agreeing that the renovations could begin immediately. They believed the room had been emptied. They believed the past had finally been sold. They believed ownership could be measured by a receipt and a bank transfer. Naomi turned away from the vacant floor and slipped her wedding ring from her finger for the first time in 12 years, holding it silently in her palm before placing it inside her coat pocket beside a folded envelope that William had never seen. It was not a divorce filing, not yet, nor was it one of the trust documents bearing the Ashford name. It contained only a handwritten note from her mother and a single sentence Naomi had memorized years earlier. When the piano leaves this house, the truth must finally return. She looked once more at the empty room, extinguished the solitary lamp beside the window, and closed the door behind her, never noticing the faint scrape mark hidden beneath the cabinet where something had once been carefully concealed. Long before the Ashford name appeared on magazine covers or private jet terminals, there had been a narrow brick townhouse in Harlem where every Sunday afternoon began with the sound of a single piano. Naomi had been 9 years old when her mother, Evelyn Carter, first lifted the fallboard and placed her small hands over the worn ivory keys. "Never rush the silence," Evelyn had whispered. "The silence tells people whether the music matters." The instrument had already been old then, its polished ebony softened by generations of careful hands. Every scratch carried a story. Every repaired key had survived another season when there had been more bills than money. Yet the piano had never represented hardship. It represented endurance. Evelyn taught neighborhood children who paid with homemade pies, flowers from tiny apartment balconies, or sometimes nothing at all. She insisted that dignity could not be measured by income and that beauty belonged to anyone willing to protect it. Naomi grew up believing those lessons more firmly than any business textbook she would later read. Years passed. Scholarships became conservatory auditions, auditions became consulting work for cultural foundations, and eventually Naomi met William Ashford before anyone called him a billionaire. He admired her intelligence, her discipline, and the quiet confidence with which she solved problems others could not even define. When they married, the piano moved into the music room of the new mansion. William had hired specialists to transport it, joking that the instrument probably cost more to move than his first apartment. Evelyn had smiled politely, but answered with unusual seriousness. "It is not the wood that matters," she said. "Promise me one thing, Naomi. If this piano ever leaves your home, you must never chase after it." Naomi remembered laughing softly, unable to imagine any reason the piano would ever leave. Evelyn had simply rested her hand against the carved music stand before reaching into the pocket of her navy coat. She removed a cream envelope sealed with dark blue wax and placed it into Naomi's hands. "Keep this where no one will think to look," she said. "Open it only after the piano is gone. Not before. Never before." Evelyn paused, resting one hand on the carved music stand. "The piano may someday belong to someone else," she said quietly. "But what rests inside it never will." Naomi had asked what was inside. Evelyn only smiled with the calm certainty that always made questions feel unnecessary. The right truth arrives after the wrong loss. A year later, Evelyn died quietly after a brief illness, leaving behind no fortune, no estate large enough to attract lawyers, and no public legacy beyond hundreds of former students who still played because she had once believed in them. The piano became the last physical piece of her presence. William gradually stopped seeing it as memory and started seeing it as furniture. Naomi never corrected him. She carefully stored the sealed envelope inside the hidden pocket of her coat and carried it through every move, every renovation, every charity gala, and every board dinner without opening it once. Tonight, after watching the moving truck disappear beyond the estate gates, she stood alone beside the dark window of the guest suite, turning the envelope over in her hands. The blue wax seal remained perfectly unbroken. Outside, rain washed across the glass while somewhere beyond the city an old grand piano traveled through the darkness toward an unknown destination, carrying far more than anyone who had signed its bill of sale could possibly understand. Then Naomi finally broke the seal. By the following afternoon, the Ashford mansion looked as though the music room had never existed. Designers moved through the house carrying samples of imported stone, custom wine racks, and architectural sketches, while Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of the empty room wearing an elegant white dress, pointing toward the walls with effortless confidence. The grand piano made the space feel heavy, she said. We should open everything. More glass. More light. Eleanor Ashford nodded approvingly from a velvet chair beneath the crystal chandelier. Exactly. We are building a future, not preserving sentiment. William glanced over the renovation plans spread across the marble table before signing another authorization without reading more than the final page. Numbers, contracts, ownership transfers, these had always obeyed him. Yesterday he had signed the bill of sale for the piano with the same detached certainty. Today he approved demolition drawings with identical confidence. To him, decisions became reality the moment his signature touched paper. Across the room, workers carefully removed the last traces of the instrument's presence. One polished away faint wheel marks in the hardwood floor, while another measured the space where custom wine cabinets would soon stand. Charlotte smiled as she imagined hosting charity receptions there, greeting investors beneath sparkling glass shelves instead of old sheet music. This room finally belongs to us, she said quietly, slipping her arm through William's. He smiled without hesitation. It always did. Neither of them noticed Naomi standing briefly in the hallway beyond the open doors. She wore a navy suit instead of morning black, her expression composed, her posture perfectly straight. She watched the renovation for only a few silent seconds before continuing toward the library without interruption. William barely looked up. Her silence had become reassuring. He interpreted it as acceptance. Eleanor interpreted it as defeat. Charlotte interpreted it as surrender. All three made the same mistake. Later that evening, guests gathered for a small private dinner celebrating a new investment partnership. Crystal glasses reflected candlelight, while conversations drifted easily between acquisitions, market forecasts, and philanthropic donations. William accepted congratulations on another successful quarter. Someone remarked that difficult decisions were often necessary to move forward. William laughed softly. Sometimes you have to let go of old things to make room for better ones. Charlotte raised her champagne flute. Eleanor smiled with unmistakable pride. Around the long dining table, no one questioned what had been sold or why. The story had already been rewritten into one of practical efficiency rather than quiet cruelty. Upstairs, Naomi sat alone in the guest suite with her mother's opened letter resting beside the untouched wedding ring. She did not reread its contents. She had already committed every line to memory during the previous night. The instructions were precise, patient, and strangely unconcerned with loss. They spoke not of recovering the piano, but of waiting. Waiting until others believed everything important had already disappeared. Waiting until certainty became blindness. Downstairs, laughter echoed through the mansion long after midnight. William believed the final chapter had closed with a single sales contract. Charlotte believed she had inherited the future room by room. Eleanor believed the Carter family's history had finally been erased from the Ashford estate. Outside, beneath a sky still heavy with rain, hundreds of miles away, the transport truck carrying the old piano slowed unexpectedly near a deserted highway service station as its driver frowned at an unfamiliar sound coming from somewhere deep inside the instrument. The transport truck had been on the interstate for nearly 4 hours when Daniel Mercer eased off the accelerator and guided the vehicle into a deserted highway service station. Rain continued to fall in thin silver lines beneath the fluorescent lights, tapping softly against the windshield while the engine settled into silence. Daniel had spent 30 years restoring rare instruments and transporting museum collections across the country. He knew every ordinary sound a piano could make while traveling. Wood shifted with temperature. Strings expanded with humidity. Felt settled after movement. But the faint metallic knock he had heard during the last 20 miles belonged to none of them. He climbed down from the cab, unlocked the cargo doors, and folded back the heavy moving blankets surrounding the grand piano. The ebony finish remained flawless despite the journey. He circled the instrument slowly, his flashlight tracing each carved leg and polished panel until the beam paused on the ornate music desk. There, almost hidden beneath years of careful restoration, he noticed an unusually precise seam in the wood. It did not resemble damage. It looked intentional. Daniel frowned. Every master craftsman left signatures in different ways, and this piano had been built by one of the finest workshops in Europe nearly a century earlier. He pressed gently against the carved molding. Nothing moved. He tried another angle. A quiet click echoed through the empty cargo compartment. A narrow compartment slid open no wider than a man's hand. Daniel froze. Inside rested a small leather portfolio wrapped carefully in faded blue linen, untouched by dust despite its age. Beneath it lay a brass medallion engraved with the crest of the Carter Foundation for Arts Education, a name Daniel recognized immediately from museum exhibitions and scholarship concerts decades earlier. He did not remove either object. Instead, he studied the compartment with growing unease. This was no forgotten repair space. It had been deliberately engineered into the instrument long before the piano entered the Ashford estate. Resting beside the portfolio was a folded document protected inside waxed parchment. Through the translucent paper, he could make out only a few typed words: Original Carter Heritage Trust Deed. Below them appeared several notarized seals that had faded but remained unmistakably authentic. Daniel slowly closed the hidden compartment exactly as he had found it. Years in the restoration business had taught him that certain discoveries carried legal consequences far beyond antiques or insurance claims. The bill of sale folded inside his jacket suddenly felt incomplete. Whoever had sold the piano clearly believed they owned every part of it. Whoever had hidden those documents seemed to believe otherwise. He climbed back into the driver's seat without restarting the engine. Instead, he searched his phone until he found the original acquisition correspondence. Naomi Carter's name appeared only once as an emergency contact attached to the transport file, though all negotiations had been conducted through William Ashford's office. Daniel read the entry twice before placing the phone back on the dashboard. Outside, dawn remained several hours away, and the highway stretched empty beneath the rain. Daniel stepped away from the piano and immediately called the auction house's legal counsel. Less than 20 minutes later, the instruction arrived. Freeze the delivery. Preserve the chain of custody. Return the instrument to the last verified residence without opening the compartment. The transport was no longer a commercial delivery. It had become a legal preservation under chain of custody protocol. As the truck merged onto the highway, a black sedan followed several car lengths behind. Inside sat Margaret Ellison, outside counsel for the Carter Heritage Trust, ensuring the instrument remained under continuous legal observation. At 5:12 the following morning, before the first pale light touched the Manhattan skyline, the security intercom inside the Ashford mansion chimed twice. The night guard frowned at the surveillance monitor. Parked beyond the iron gates stood the same enclosed transport truck that had departed less than 12 hours earlier. Rain still clung to its polished panels, and its headlights remained on, cutting through the lingering darkness. Daniel Mercer stepped from the cab, holding nothing except a sealed cream envelope. "I need to speak with the property's owner," he told the guard. Immediately. Within minutes, William Ashford descended the grand staircase wearing a charcoal cashmere robe over pressed trousers, irritation already visible on his face. Eleanor appeared moments later, wrapping a silk shawl around her shoulders, while Charlotte lingered behind them in a white satin robe, confused by the unexpected disturbance. Naomi emerged last. She wore a simple black sweater and dark trousers, her expression as composed. as it had been the evening before. No one spoke to her. Outside, the truck remained silent behind the gates. William unlocked the entrance himself and strode across the rain-soaked driveway. "There must be some mistake," he said sharply. "The sale was completed yesterday." Daniel handed him the envelope without argument. "The transaction cannot continue," he replied. "I am returning the piano exactly as it left." William stared at him. "On what authority?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "On the authority of the auction house's legal counsel." The discovery triggered a chain of custody preservation order. A brief silence settled over the driveway. The black sedan stopped behind the truck, and Margaret Ellison stepped out in a gray coat, carrying a leather folder embossed with the Carter Heritage Trust seal. Charlotte glanced uneasily toward Eleanor, who immediately folded her arms. "This is ridiculous," she said. "An antique dealer cannot simply reverse a signed purchase." Daniel neither agreed nor disagreed. "I have not opened what I found," he said calmly. "I have not removed it. I have not altered the condition of the instrument. I was advised to return it to its place of origin immediately." William's expression hardened. "Advised by whom?" Daniel looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Because ownership of the piano and ownership of what was concealed inside it may not be the same under the law." Without waiting for permission, the movers carefully lowered the grand piano from the truck. Rain shimmered across its polished ebony surface as its brass wheels rolled once more over the stone driveway toward the mansion. Naomi watched every movement without taking a single step forward. She neither smiled nor appeared surprised. Her eyes rested instead on the sealed cream envelope still in William's hand. He finally broke the seal. Inside lay only one folded sheet bearing a single typed sentence. The original Carter Heritage Trust deed remains secured inside the concealed compartment. Please consult qualified legal counsel before attempting further transfer of ownership. No signature appeared beneath the message. William read it twice, before looking back toward Daniel. "What trust deed?" Daniel simply shook his head. "I never looked." That answer somehow unsettled William more than any explanation could have. The piano was rolled back into the empty music room just as dawn began to brighten the windows overlooking the city. It settled into its original position with quiet precision, as though it had never left. Before departing, Daniel placed one final envelope directly on the closed keyboard. "This was resting beside the compartment," he said softly. "It belongs with the instrument." Naomi remained perfectly still as everyone stared at the envelope lying alone upon the polished black lid. No one reached for it. The envelope remained unopened on the piano until the house grew quiet again. Morning sunlight slowly climbed across the polished ebony lid, illuminating the instrument that had returned before dawn as though it had ignored the sale entirely. William stood beside it with crossed arms, studying the cream envelope as if it were an unwanted legal notice. Charlotte lingered near the doorway, no longer wearing the confidence she had displayed the previous afternoon. Eleanor insisted the entire incident was nothing more than a cautious transporter protecting himself from liability. "Open it," she finally said. "Whatever this is, we'll have our attorneys settle it before lunch." William reached for the envelope, but Naomi spoke before his fingers touched it. "It wasn't addressed to you." Her voice was calm, neither accusing nor emotional. It simply interrupted the certainty that had governed the mansion for years. William looked at her for a long moment before withdrawing his hand. Without another word, Naomi stepped forward, lifted the envelope, and quietly broke the seal. Inside rested a single handwritten note folded around an old black-and-white photograph. The photograph showed her mother standing beside the same grand piano nearly 40 years earlier inside a modest concert hall. Several distinguished patrons surrounded her, smiling toward the camera beneath a banner that read Carter Foundation for Arts Education. Naomi recognized every face except one. On the reverse side, written in Evelyn Carter's unmistakable handwriting, were only a few words. "Never let them mistake the instrument for the inheritance." The note beneath the photograph explained little more, yet every sentence carried the quiet precision Naomi remembered from her mother's letters. Evelyn wrote that the foundation had never begun with wealthy donors or influential families. It had started with teachers, performers, and community leaders who believed access to music should belong to every child. For decades, the piano accompanied every signing ceremony of the Carter Heritage Trust, It was present whenever trustees accepted new fiduciary obligations or transferred legal responsibility for the foundation's protected cultural assets. It witnessed the execution of the original trust deed, the foundation charter, and every appointment of a successor trustee since the trust was established. Evelyn never called herself the founder, even though she had drafted the original Carter Heritage Trust. She always described herself as its first founding trustee, believing the trust should always matter more than the person protecting it. She reminded Naomi that being a trustee was never about ownership. It was a fiduciary duty, the legal obligation to protect the trust, its cultural assets, and every beneficiary until the next rightful trustee could assume that responsibility. The letter ended with a final instruction. If anyone ever values this piano only for its wood, they have already revealed they do not understand what truly belongs to them. Naomi folded the note carefully and looked once more at the photograph. Memories returned with unexpected clarity. As a teenager, she had waited backstage while her mother met quietly with lawyers, museum directors, and philanthropists after fundraising concerts. At the time, Naomi believed they were discussing donations. She now remembered seeing thick document folders exchanged beside the piano after audiences had gone home. She remembered her mother refusing to leave the instrument unattended even for a few minutes. She remembered hearing the phrase, fiduciary responsibility under the Carter Heritage Trust, long before she was old enough to understand that it described a legal duty rather than a family tradition. William watched her expression change, but could not interpret it. To him, the photograph appeared sentimental, nothing more. Eleanor dismissed it with visible impatience. Charlotte shifted uneasily, sensing that everyone in the room had begun participating in a conversation she did not understand. Naomi returned the photograph to its envelope and rested her hand gently on the closed keyboard. She now understood why her mother had never worried about someone stealing the piano. Evelyn had worried about something far more dangerous, someone believing that buying the instrument also meant buying the legal authority hidden within it. Under the Carter Heritage Trust, the piano itself could be sold, inherited, or donated. The legal authority hidden inside it never could. Somewhere beneath the polished wood, concealed behind craftsmanship no ordinary collector would ever notice, waited the evidence her mother had trusted time itself to reveal. The mansion settled into an uneasy silence after sunrise. Staff members moved carefully through the hallways, sensing that something had shifted even if no one could explain what it was. The grand piano once again occupied its familiar place beneath the tall windows, its polished surface reflecting pale morning light across the marble floor as though the previous day's sale had never happened. William instructed everyone to leave the music room untouched until his attorneys arrived. Charlotte objected quietly, insisting the renovation schedule would be delayed, but he dismissed her without looking up from his phone. 3 different law firms had already returned his calls with the same advice. Do not attempt to open the concealed compartment. Preserve the chain of custody. Document every step. The language irritated him. He had spent his career controlling transactions, not waiting for permission to understand property he believed he already owned. Naomi listened to none of the conversations. After breakfast, she quietly changed into a tailored navy suit, placed her mother's handwritten letter inside a leather portfolio, and slipped the wedding ring she no longer wore into a small velvet pouch. She paused only once beside the piano, resting 2 fingers lightly against its closed lid before lifting the cream envelope Daniel had left behind. Without opening the hidden compartment or touching anything inside the instrument, she carried the envelope into William's private study. There she removed a blank legal pad and wrote 3 names from memory: Margaret Ellison, senior trust attorney; Judge Harold Benton, retired probate mediator; and Dr. Samuel Rhodes, executive director of the Carter Foundation. Each had known her mother personally decades earlier. None had spoken publicly about the foundation in years. Naomi made no dramatic phone calls. She simply sent each of them the same brief message requesting a confidential meeting before the end of the day. Attached was a photograph of the handwritten note Evelyn had left beside the piano. Nothing more. Then she closed the portfolio and left the study exactly as she had found it. Hours later, replies began arriving one after another. Margaret accepted immediately. Judge Benton canceled an afternoon engagement. Dr. Rhodes answered with only 4 words, "I have been waiting." Naomi read every response without visible emotion before placing her phone back inside her handbag. She informed neither William nor Eleanor of her plans. They remained occupied with insurance policies, ownership records, and increasingly complicated conversations about the antique dealer's legal responsibilities. Their attention never drifted beyond the piano itself. Naomi's attention had already moved elsewhere. By late afternoon, she stepped into a waiting Blacktown car parked beyond the mansion gates. The driver asked for the destination. "The Carter Foundation archives," she replied calmly. The vehicle disappeared into city traffic while rain clouds gathered once more above Manhattan. Back inside the mansion, William finally unlocked the study where Naomi had spent part of her morning. He noticed nothing disturbed until his eyes fell upon a single sheet of paper accidentally left beneath a crystal paperweight. It contained no confidential information, no legal arguments, and no accusations. Only 3 handwritten initials remained visible where the page had been folded: M.E., H.B., and S.R. William frowned. None of the names meant anything to him. Yet somewhere deep beneath that uncertainty, a feeling he rarely experienced began to settle quietly into his thoughts. For the first time since selling the piano, he realized Naomi was no longer reacting to his decisions. She was making her own. William Ashford had faced hostile acquisitions, federal audits, and market crashes without ever allowing uncertainty to show on his face. Yet by the following morning, a different kind of pressure had settled quietly around him. It arrived not through headlines or shareholder letters, but through a series of increasingly unsettling phone calls. His senior legal counsel requested an emergency meeting before reviewing the piano. A second attorney declined to offer an opinion until every document connected to the sale had been preserved. By noon, the antique dealer's insurer informed him that all further correspondence would be handled by outside counsel specializing in trust property disputes. None of them accused William of wrongdoing. None reassured him either. Their caution disturbed him more than open conflict ever could. He sat alone inside his glass-walled office overlooking the city while the cream envelope Daniel Mercer had delivered rested beside the original bill of sale. The transaction that had seemed so ordinary less than 48 hours earlier now appeared strangely incomplete. Charlotte entered carrying coffee, hoping to interrupt the growing tension. "This is getting out of proportion," she said with an encouraging smile. "It's an old piano. Someone probably hid valuable memorabilia inside it years ago." William looked toward the skyline instead of answering. "If that's true," he said quietly, "why has every attorney I've spoken to told me not to touch it?" Charlotte had no reply. Across the mansion, Eleanor attempted to dismiss the entire affair as theatrical nonsense, but even she noticed the difference. William had canceled 2 investor lunches, postponed a television interview, and instructed household staff not to allow anyone into the music room. His confidence had become caution. That alone unsettled her. Meanwhile, Naomi arrived at the Carter Foundation archives, where Margaret Ellison, Judge Harold Benton, and Dr. Samuel Rhodes waited in a quiet conference room lined with photographs from decades of scholarship concerts. No reporters stood outside. No assistants attended the meeting. Naomi placed her mother's letter, the photograph, and Daniel's note on the polished oak table without saying a word. Margaret adjusted her glasses as she read the handwritten instructions twice before exchanging a long glance with Judge Benton. Dr. Rhodes closed his eyes briefly, as though recognizing something he had expected for years. "Evelyn finally allowed the process to begin," he whispered. Naomi simply nodded. No one mentioned William. No one discussed revenge. Their conversation focused entirely on the Carter Heritage Trust, dormant trust provisions, fiduciary obligations, and successor trustee activation. Every page they reviewed appeared older than Naomi herself, bearing signatures from community leaders, benefactors, and legal witnesses whose names had nearly disappeared from public memory. None of the documents transferred immediate ownership of wealth. They established responsibility. Late that afternoon, William's phone rang again. This time, the caller identified himself as the counsel representing the Carter Heritage Trust and its affiliated foundation. "Our review now includes historical licensing rights, trust administration, and successor trustee verification." The attorney spoke politely, requesting a formal meeting regarding materials believed to be associated with the recently recovered piano. William agreed immediately. masking his unease with practiced professionalism. After ending the call, he noticed Charlotte watching him from the doorway. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. William answered after a long silence. "I don't think anyone has told me the whole story." Across the city, Naomi closed the final archive folder and looked toward the rain beginning to fall outside the conference room windows, knowing that the next meeting would no longer concern a piano alone. 2 mornings later, the Ashford boardroom overlooked Manhattan beneath clear autumn skies, yet the atmosphere inside felt heavier than the rain that had passed the previous week. William arrived early expecting to discuss quarterly investments, but instead found several directors already gathered in quiet conversation. Their usual confidence had been replaced by measured reserve. No one mentioned the piano. No one needed to. The legal memorandum delivered to every board member before dawn had already altered the room. It did not accuse William of misconduct. It simply confirmed that historical trust records connected to the Carter Heritage Trust had entered formal legal review and advised interested parties to avoid any action that might compromise evidence or fiduciary obligations. The language was cautious, professional, and impossible to ignore. William remained composed as he took his seat at the head of the polished conference table. "Let's proceed with the agenda," he said evenly. Before the chief financial officer could begin, the board secretary cleared her throat. "There is one preliminary matter." She distributed sealed packets across the table. Each contained copies of archival correspondence recently certified by Judge Harold Benton, along with a cover letter from Margaret Ellison confirming that several dormant trust agreements were undergoing authentication. The packets revealed little substance, but every page carried original signatures, notarized seals, and dates reaching back decades before William had founded Ashford Capital. Across the table, directors who had always deferred to William now read every page in complete silence. Questions began quietly. Had the foundation ever maintained historical partnerships with Ashford entities? Were there unresolved fiduciary relationships? Could any charitable assets have been administered under legacy agreements predating the company's expansion? William answered carefully. "To my knowledge, no." A board member looked up from the appendix. "Mr. Ashford, did you know your wife had already been designated as the successor trustee under the Carter Heritage Trust?" William's answer came after a long silence. "No. For the first time in years." Those words failed to settle the room. Meanwhile, across the city, Naomi sat with Dr. Samuel Rhodes inside the Carter Foundation's original recital hall. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows onto rows of empty wooden seats where children had once attended scholarship concerts. Dr. Rhodes handed her a leather archive case secured with brass clasps. "Your mother instructed that this remain sealed until the trust activation process officially resumed," he said. Naomi accepted it without opening the clasps. She had waited decades already. One more day changed nothing. Her strength had never depended on immediate answers. Back at the mansion, Charlotte noticed subtle changes she could not explain. Household staff addressed Naomi with renewed respect. Eleanor's private calls with old family friends ended abruptly whenever Naomi entered a room. Even William had stopped referring to the piano as furniture. That evening, he walked alone into the music room where the instrument stood beneath fading sunset light. He rested one hand on its polished lid, but withdrew before touching the concealed compartment. For the first time, the piano no longer felt like property. It felt like evidence. His phone vibrated again. The caller identified herself as Margaret Ellison. "Mr. Ashford," she said politely, "the authentication process is progressing faster than expected. We would appreciate your attendance tomorrow afternoon. Several individuals you have never met will be present, and I believe you'll want to hear what they have to say." William ended the call without responding. Standing alone before the returned piano, he realized that every assumption he had made about ownership, legacy, and even his marriage was beginning to shift beneath his feet, while somewhere inside the unopened leather archive case, Naomi already possessed the patience to let the truth arrive at exactly the right moment. The conference room inside the Carter Foundation overlooked the same recital hall where Evelyn Carter had once organized scholarship concerts decades earlier. Nothing about the room suggested wealth. Oak shelves held carefully preserved archives, framed photographs, lined the walls, and sunlight filtered quietly through stained glass that softened every edge. William Ashford entered precisely on time, accompanied by his lead attorney. Across the table sat Naomi, Margaret Ellison, Judge Harold Benton, and Dr. Samuel Rhodes. No reporters waited outside. No cameras recorded the meeting. This was not a public confrontation. It was a private accounting of history. Margaret opened a leather binder and slid several authenticated documents across the polished table. "Mr. Ashford," she said evenly, "these records have now been verified." William reviewed the first page without expression. It identified Evelyn Carter as the founding trustee of the Carter Heritage Trust. The second established the permanent trust structure of the Carter Heritage Trust, placing its protected cultural assets under designated trustees rather than private owners. The third contained notarized signatures confirming that certain documents had been intentionally concealed within the Foundation's concert piano until the trust activation conditions were satisfied. William read each page carefully before placing them back on the table. "None of this transfers ownership of my company," he said. "Correct," Judge Benton replied calmly. "That was never its purpose." Silence settled across the room. Dr. Rhodes folded his hands. "Your misunderstanding, Mr. Ashford, is the same one many people made over the years. The piano was never valuable because of what it was worth. It was valuable because of what it protected." Margaret continued. "When the instrument was voluntarily removed from its designated trust custody location, the activation clause of the Carter Heritage Trust automatically took effect." William frowned. "Meaning?" "The sale itself had never been invalid," Margaret replied calmly. "What triggered the legal review was the attempted transfer of trust property concealed within the instrument, not the transfer of the instrument itself." She continued. "That means every historical partnership, donation commitment, licensing arrangement, and intellectual property archive connected to the Foundation must now be independently reviewed before any future representation of those assets may continue." William remained silent. For the first time in many years, no immediate solution presented itself. His attorney quietly requested copies for further examination. By sunset, 3 institutional donors suspended their sponsorships pending legal review. The Foundation quietly removed Ashford Capital from its strategic partners page. William's board requested an emergency ethics committee meeting. For the first time in 20 years, William left a boardroom without anyone following him. Across the table, Naomi said nothing. She had not interrupted once. She had not corrected William. She simply listened while others explained the responsibilities her mother had carried without recognition. When the meeting concluded, several attendees who had long admired William's business leadership paused before leaving. Their expressions remained respectful, but something fundamental had changed. They no longer looked only toward him when discussing the Foundation's future. Their questions naturally turned toward Naomi. Dr. Rhodes asked whether she would consider advising the trust review. Judge Benton requested her availability for future consultations. Margaret thanked her for preserving Evelyn's original instructions. None of them spoke as though Naomi were merely William's wife. They addressed her as the person history had expected all along. Charlotte, waiting quietly in the lobby, watched through the glass doors as each respected figure paused to shake Naomi's hand before departing. The gesture lasted only seconds, yet it unsettled her more than any argument could have. William exited the building several moments later carrying the authenticated documents beneath his arm. He glanced toward Naomi standing alone beneath the stone entrance, her posture calm against the late afternoon light. For the first time since their marriage began, he understood that the greatest mistake he had made was never selling the piano. It was believing the woman who had protected it possessed nothing else worth guarding. The rain returned just before dusk, settling over the Ashford estate in a quiet silver curtain that blurred the city lights beyond. The iron gates. Inside the mansion, every room seemed unusually still, as though the house itself had grown tired of carrying conversations no one wished to finish. William stood alone outside the music room for several minutes before finally stepping inside. The grand piano rested beneath the tall windows exactly where it had always belonged, its polished surface reflecting the soft glow of the lamps Eleanor had once insisted should illuminate paintings instead. He remembered the afternoon he had ordered it removed. At the time, the decision had felt practical, almost insignificant. Now the instrument occupied the room with a gravity he had never noticed before. It was no longer simply a piano. It had become the silent witness to everything he had failed to understand. Naomi entered quietly a few moments later, dressed in a charcoal coat over a simple black dress, her leather portfolio resting against one arm. She had just returned from another meeting with Margaret Ellison and Dr. Samuel Rhodes. William turned toward her, but the confidence that had once defined every conversation between them had disappeared. For the first time since their marriage began, he searched for words instead of conclusions. "Naomi," he said softly, "would you stay for a moment?" She nodded without speaking. The silence between them felt strangely familiar, not uncomfortable, but honest. William glanced toward the piano before looking back at her. "I spent years believing I understood what mattered to you," he said. "I thought I knew the difference between sentiment and value." Naomi listened without interrupting. He continued more quietly. "I was wrong." The admission lingered in the room. It contained no dramatic apology, no desperate promises, only the weight of a realization that had arrived too late to erase what had already happened. Days earlier, a housekeeper had found Naomi's velvet pouch in the library and quietly placed it on William's desk. Now he opened it slowly. Inside rested Naomi's wedding ring. He held the box toward her with steady hands. "This belongs to you." Naomi looked at the ring for several seconds before gently closing the lid with 2 fingers. She did not. "Take it." "No," she answered quietly. It belonged to the woman who believed respect could be protected by love alone. William lowered his eyes. Outside, rain traced long silver lines across the windows while distant thunder rolled above the city. Neither Eleanor nor Charlotte interrupted them. The mansion remained silent. Naomi placed her leather portfolio on the closed lid of the piano. Inside rested authenticated trust records, archival correspondence, and the legal acknowledgments that would guide the foundation forward. None of them represented revenge. Every page represented responsibility. She looked toward William one final time. "My mother never asked me to protect a marriage," she said. "She asked me to protect what could not speak for itself." William understood then that she was no longer asking him to become a better husband. She no longer needed that answer. The question had already passed. Naomi picked up the portfolio and turned toward the doorway. Before leaving the room, she paused only long enough to rest her fingertips gently against the polished piano, then walked into the quiet hallway without looking back. William remained standing beside the unopened velvet box, realizing that losing an argument would have been far easier than watching dignity leave the room without anger, without accusation, and without ever asking permission. Spring arrived quietly in Manhattan several months later. The trees lining the avenue outside the Carter Foundation unfolded new leaves beneath clear morning light, and children carrying violin cases and music folders crossed the stone courtyard with the easy excitement that belonged only to beginnings. Inside the restored recital hall, the old grand piano stood beneath the stained glass windows exactly where Naomi had chosen to place it after the trust review concluded. It no longer belonged inside a private mansion hidden behind iron gates. It belonged where every note could once again become an opportunity for someone who had never been given one. The legal process had ended without public scandal. The authenticated trust documents confirmed the original trust structure exactly as Evelyn Carter had intended. Historical archives, educational records, intellectual property files, and philanthropic agreements had all been transferred into permanent preservation under the Carter Foundation's governance. Nothing had been taken from William by force. Instead, history had simply been restored to the place where it had always belonged. Naomi never accepted the position of executive director despite repeated requests. She accepted the legal responsibility of successor trustee for the Carter Heritage Trust. From that day forward, every licensing agreement bearing the Carter name required Naomi's written approval. In that role, she guided the trust's long-term preservation while allowing younger educators and musicians to shape the foundation's future. It suited her perfectly. She had never wanted recognition. She had wanted continuity. One afternoon, she walked alone through the recital hall before the annual scholarship concert. She rested her hand lightly on the polished piano lid and smiled as children rehearsed quietly in nearby practice rooms. Their music drifted through the building with the same gentle confidence her mother had once carried into every lesson. Evelyn had been right. Beautiful things survived when someone chose responsibility over possession. Across the city, William remained inside his office overlooking the skyline he had spent decades conquering. Ashford Capital remained wealthy, but it could no longer use the Carter legacy, archives, or educational programs without Naomi Carter's authorization. Investors remained. Projects continued. Yet one framed photograph now occupied a quiet corner of his bookshelf. It showed Naomi years earlier beside the grand piano during a foundation recital he had almost forgotten attending. He found himself looking at it more often than quarterly reports. Some losses never appeared on financial statements because they could not be measured by numbers. Eleanor visited the mansion less frequently than before. Charlotte had quietly accepted a position with another firm months earlier, leaving without anger after realizing she had mistaken influence for permanence. Life had continued for everyone, though not along the paths they had once imagined. On the evening of the scholarship concert, the recital hall filled with families, teachers, former students, and community leaders. No reserved section bore the Ashford name. The event honored Evelyn Carter and every trustee who had protected the foundation across generations. As the first young pianist approached the bench, Naomi took a seat near the back of the hall rather than in the front row prepared for her. She preferred to watch others step into the light. Before the performance began, she reached into her handbag and found the small velvet box William had returned months earlier. She opened it one final time. The wedding ring rested inside, unchanged. With a quiet smile, she closed the lid again and placed the box inside the foundation archives, where it would remain not as a symbol of regret, but as a reminder that dignity could never be purchased, inherited, or sold. It could only be chosen. Then the first note rose from the piano, filling the hall with music that belonged to everyone, while Naomi listened without looking back, knowing she had not won by defeating a man. She had never been fighting to keep a billionaire husband. She had been protecting a legacy that no amount of money could ever purchase.